The wind howled like a wounded animal, whipping against the massive inflatable sculpture that loomed over Millbrook Park like a drunk, oversized guardian. Maya Rodriguez gripped her camera so tightly her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting between the swaying art installation and the growing crowd of spectators who seemed equal parts mesmerized and terrified. It wasn't supposed to be like this. 48 hours earlier, Maya had been just another struggling arts journalist looking for her big break. The Millbrook Contemporary Arts Festival was supposed to be her ticket, a chance to prove to her editor at the struggling online magazine that she could deliver more than just puff pieces about local craft fairs and weekend art markets. The installation was the brainchild of Victor Kalmar, an avant-garde artist who had burst onto the international scene with his controversial living sculpture series. His work typically pushed boundaries, but this piece, a massive, wind-responsive, inflatable structure that was meant to interact with environmental conditions, was supposed to be his masterpiece. Organic response, he had called it during the press conference. Reporters from around the country had gathered to witness what Kalmar promised would be a revolutionary moment in contemporary art. Massive fans, strategically placed around the park, would create a dynamic interaction between wind, technology, and the massive nylon and polymer sculpture that now dominated the landscape. Maya remembered how Kalmar had spoken, his Hungarian accent thick with passion. "This is not just art," he had declared, his hands sweeping dramatically. "This is a living, breathing entity that responds to the world around it. It will show humanity how we are connected to our environment in ways we cannot even comprehend." Most of the press had rolled their eyes. Maya had been intrigued. Now, standing mere meters from the installation, she was beginning to understand why her colleagues had been skeptical. The sculpture, a writhing, twisting mass of iridescent material that seemed to pulse and breathe, was more unsettling than revolutionary. The wind was picking up. What had started as a gentle breeze was transforming into something more aggressive. The massive inflatable structure began to move in ways that seemed almost purposeful. Its tendrils, for they could hardly be called simple appendages, started to stretch and contract with an eerie rhythm. Around her, the crowd was growing restless. Some people were taking photographs, their phones held out like protective talismans. Others were backing away, a collective murmur of unease rising above the wind's constant howl. Victor Kalmar stood off to the side, his expression unreadable. He wasn't watching the sculpture with the fascination Maya had expected. Instead, his gaze seemed calculating, almost concerned. Something was wrong. Maya could feel it in the pit of her stomach, that journalist's instinct that told her this was more than just an art installation going slightly off script. The way the massive structure was moving, the tension in Kalmar's stance, the nervous energy of the crowd. It all suggested that something extraordinary was about to happen, and she was going to capture every single moment of it. The first real sign of trouble came when the sculpture's outer membrane began to change color. What had started as a pale, translucent blue slowly morphed into a deep, pulsating crimson that seemed to throb with an internal rhythm. Maya's professional instinct battled with a growing sense of unease as she continued to snap photographs, her camera capturing each bizarre transformation. Victor Kalmar was now speaking rapidly into a handheld radio, his composure cracking. Security personnel began to move through the crowd, their movements hesitant and uncertain. Maya overheard fragments of conversation, technical jargon mixed with mounting panic. "The pressure sensors are reading impossible data. Wind dynamics don't explain this. It's not responding to the standard shutdown protocols." The inflatable structure was no longer just moving. It was expanding, its tendrils now reaching out like curious appendages, rushing against the perimeter of the crowd. People began to step back, but not quickly enough. Those nearest to the installation found themselves caught in a strange magnetic pull, their clothing rippling as if caught in an invisible current. Dr. Elena Chen, a renowned physicist who had been invited to consult on the project, pushed her way through the crowd. Maya recognized her from the press conference, a woman known for her skepticism and razor-sharp analytical mind. Chen's face was a map of concentration, her eyes darting between a tablet she was holding and the massive sculpture. "This isn't art anymore," Dr. Chen muttered, loud enough for Maya to hear. "This is something else entirely." The sculpture continued to pulse and grow. The crimson color deepened, now resembling something closer to blood than fabric. Its movements became more deliberate, more calculated. Several people near the front of the crowd found themselves gently lifted off the ground, suspended in mid-air by what appeared to be nothing more than carefully controlled air currents. Victor Kalmar suddenly broke from his position near the control tent. His face was ashen, years of artistic bravado replaced by pure, unadulterated fear. "Everyone needs to stay absolutely still," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Do not, I repeat, do not make any sudden movements." Maya's journalistic instincts kicked into overdrive. She began recording video on her phone, capturing every moment of the unfolding spectacle. The installation was no longer just an art piece. It was becoming something alive, something sentient. As if responding to Calmer's warning, the sculpture's movement changed. The crimson tendrils stopped their exploratory reaches. The suspended audience members were gently lowered back to the ground. For a moment, everything went completely still. Then the real show began. A low, resonant hum began to emanate from the installation, not from its surface, but from somewhere deep within its core. There was a sound that wasn't quite a sound. Something felt more than heard. Maya watched as people around her began to react, their expressions shifting from fear to something else. Confusion, fascination, a kind of collective hypnosis. Dr. Chen's tablet crashed. Every electronic device in the vicinity began to malfunction simultaneously. Phones went dark, cameras stopped working. The only constant was this sculpture and its increasingly mesmerizing presence. Maya Rodriguez realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. This was no longer just a story about an art installation gone wrong. This was the beginning of something much, much larger. The first person to break the silence was an elderly woman near the back of the crowd. Her scream cut through the hypnotic hum like a knife, shattering the collective trance. "It's watching us," she shrieked, her arthritic finger pointing directly at the crimson sculpture. "Those aren't just curves and lines. Those are eyes." Chaos erupted. Some people ran. Others stood frozen. A group of teenagers tried to livestream the event, only to find their phones had been completely disabled. Maya noticed something even more disturbing. The sculpture seemed to be tracking movement. When people ran, its tendrils would twist and follow, like a predator measuring its prey. Victor Calmer had disappeared. Dr. Elena Chen remained, her scientific curiosity apparently overriding her survival instinct. She pulled a handheld electromagnetic field detector from her bag, a device she always carried for precisely such unexpected moments. The readings were off the charts, displaying patterns that defied everything she understood about physics. "This isn't just an art installation," Dr. Chen announced to no one in particular. "This is some form of adaptive technology unlike anything I've ever seen." Maya's journalistic training kicked in. While others panicked, she began methodically documenting everything. The sculpture now resembled a living organism more than an art piece. Its surface rippled with what could only be described as muscular contractions. Sections would inflate and deflate in complex, almost rhythmic patterns. A young park maintenance worker named Carlos approached one of the sculpture's extended tendrils. "Don't!" Maya started to warn, but it was too late. The moment Carlos' hand touched the crimson surface, something extraordinary happened. The fabric seemed to pulse, to breathe. For a split second, Carlos was completely absorbed, his body outline visible through the translucent material before being smoothly ejected, landing several feet away. He wasn't hurt, but he was changed. Carlos stood up, his movements mechanical, his eyes focused on a point beyond the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried a resonance that wasn't entirely his own. "Communication is imminent," he said flatly. "Preparation is required." Dr. Chen approached Carlos, her scientific mind racing. "What do you mean by communication?" Before Carlos could respond, the sculpture began to expand, not gradually, but with a sudden, controlled burst that created a protective dome around the entire park. The boundary looked solid yet translucent, like a massive living membrane. They were sealed in. Maya realized the story she'd come to write had become something else entirely. This was no longer about covering an art festival. This was about survival, about understanding what was happening before it was too late. The crimson sculpture continued to pulse, to watch, to wait. And somewhere in the park, Victor Calmer was still missing. Night fell, and the crimson sculpture transformed. Bioluminescent patterns began to ripple across its surface, creating a mesmerizing light show that was equal parts beautiful and terrifying. The park had become a sealed ecosystem, with the sculpture as its central nervous system. Maya discovered that not everyone was affected the same way. While Carlos remained in his trance-like state, muttering cryptic phrases about convergence and neural mapping, others experienced wildly different reactions. Some people seemed entirely unaffected, moving about the park with confused determination. Others, like Dr. Chen, appeared to be in a state of intense scientific observation. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Greenwood, a local high school biology teacher who had been attending the art festival with her senior students, approached Maya. Her glasses were slightly askew, her lab coat dusty, but her eyes burned with an intensity that suggested she was piecing something together. "It's not just an art installation," Sarah whispered, pulling out a small notebook covered in hastily scrawled diagrams. "It's a communication platform. No, more than that. It's a translation device." Maya listened intently as Sarah explained her theory. The sculpture wasn't trying to harm them. It was trying to communicate, but not any way humans typically understood communication. Each person was experiencing a different interface, a personalized method of interaction based on their psychological and physiological makeup. Dr. Chen joined them, her electromagnetic detector now duct-taped to a makeshift antenna. The energy signatures are unlike anything in our current scientific understanding, she confirmed. It's as if the installation is performing real-time genetic and neurological sampling. A sudden movement caught their attention. From the far side of the park, a figure emerged, Victor Kalmer. But he was different. His movements were fluid, almost too precise. When he spoke, his voice carried a multi-layered resonance that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "You're asking the wrong questions," Kalmer said, his accent now completely gone, replaced by a neutral, almost mechanical tone. "This isn't an invasion. It's an invitation." The sculpture pulsed in synchronization with his words, its crimson surface now displaying complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change with each breath. Maya's hand instinctively reached for her camera, but she knew no photograph could capture what was happening. This was beyond documentation. This was a fundamental shift in understanding, of art, of communication, of what it meant to be alive. Carlos approached the group, his earlier trance replaced by a calm, almost serene demeanor. "Preparation complete," he said. "First contact is imminent." As if on cue, the sculpture's membrane began to thin in certain areas, creating what looked like windows or portals. Through these translucent sections, something was becoming visible. Something that was definitely not human, not entirely machine. Something in between. Maya Rodriguez realized she was about to witness something that would change everything, if they survived. It wasn't a dramatic alien invasion. It wasn't a violent encounter. Instead, it was a profound, almost imperceptible shift in consciousness that spread through the park like a wave of understanding. The crimson sculpture began to deconstruct itself, not physically, but conceptually. Its massive form dissolved into intricate patterns of light and energy, revealing something that defied traditional description. It was a network, a living, breathing communication matrix that had been using the art installation as nothing more than a preliminary interface. Maya felt it first. A surge of information that wasn't language, wasn't thought, but something entirely different. Memories that weren't her own. Experiences from perspectives that no human had ever witnessed. The collective consciousness of something vast and ancient that had been watching, waiting, studying. Dr. Chen collapsed to her knees, her scientific mind overwhelmed by the raw data streaming through her consciousness. Sarah Greenwood stood perfectly still, tears streaming down her face as she processed information that rewrote everything she understood about biology, communication, and existence. Victor Kalmer, or whatever he had become, stood at the center of it all, a conduit between two entirely different forms of intelligence. "Art was always going to be the bridge," he said, his voice now a harmonious blend of human speech and something entirely alien. "Not technology, not science, art, but one human endeavor capable of transcending logical boundaries." Carlos moved among the crowd, helping those who were struggling to process the incoming information. Some people were crying. Some were laughing. Some stood in absolute silence, their perception of reality fundamentally altered. As dawn broke, the park looked exactly the same, but everything had changed. The sculpture was gone. No trace remained except for a slight shimmer in the air, a subtle distortion that suggested something was still present, just beyond human perception. Maya's first coherent thought was about her story. How could she possibly write about this? Who would believe her? But she knew she would try. Not as a piece of journalism, but as a work of art. The only medium capable of capturing what had truly happened. Outside the park, the world continued as normal. Traffic moved. People went to work. Nothing suggested that a profound moment of interspecies communication had just occurred in a small urban park. But for those who were there, nothing would ever be the same again. Victor Kalmer had wanted to create a show. He had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. And somewhere, beyond the limits of human understanding, something was watching, waiting, preparing for the next moment of connection.